Welcome to our Mind Institute Facebook Live, where UC Davis Health experts provide information that you want to know. I'm Marianne Sharp. Today, we'll be talking about the best instructional practices in math and literacy for students with autism. Three experts have joined us to discuss their research into student-teacher interactions in math and literacy, and they will also take your questions. Nicole Sparapani is an assistant professor in the School of Education and a faculty member of Mind Institute. Dr. Sparapani has a background in speech language pathology, developmental psychology, and education. Welcome. Peter Mundy is a distinguished professor of education and a professor in the School of Medicine's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. He is also the Lisa Capps Chair in Neurodevelopmental Disorders and Education and a Mind Institute faculty member. Dr. Mundy is a developmental and clinical psychologist and an expert in the education and development of children with autism. Welcome, Dr. Mundy.
Hi.
And Nancy Tseng is a supervisor of teacher education in the School of Education, who began her career as a public elementary school teacher. Dr. Tseng's research interests focus on the development of productive student-teacher relationships in elementary classrooms. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you all three for being with us today. If you have any questions throughout our discussion, please feel free to post them in the comments and we will have our experts answer them toward the end of the conversation. So it seems smart to start with some background about this topic, though I'm sure it varies quite widely. How well are children with autism doing academically as a group? And this seems like one that maybe you might all want to address. Maybe start with you, Dr. Mundy.
We were having a discussion just before the start of this, and one part of that discussion was we don't know enough about how well children with autism are doing in school. We know a little bit more about preschool children than school-age children, but basically the children with autism vary wildly in how well they do in school, with a minority of children with autism doing average or above average in general ed, then another cluster of children in general ed exhibiting some real learning problems, and we'll talk about those, and then another group of children whose verbal abilities don't develop as well as we would hope they would by first grade. They're going to struggle, but they'll have more assistance in school.
Dr. Tseng or Sparapani, would either of you like to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, and a great question to start off with. And as Peter had suggested, or just had acknowledged, that there's just so much more to learn. So when we think about individuals with autism and the literature or the research that's been happening over the past 30 or more years, very little has really targeted specifically, in the classroom, how are kids doing academically. When we look at statistics, it really kind of paints this very grim picture. So we know that folks with disabilities in general, including kids with autism, in terms of math and literacy proficiency, there's only about 12% overall that are proficient by fourth grade. So we really have this kind of educational gap when we're looking at learners with and without disabilities. And then in some earlier work that I had done, when we looked at engagement of kids with classrooms, or with kids with autism in classrooms, we saw this kind of overall limited engagement in terms of how they participated in classroom activities. And that was across both general and special education classrooms. And then last, and this may be a jump off point, Nancy, if you wanted to add anything in here, when we actually look at the literature in how professionals, particularly general educators, how they kind of feel about educating individuals with autism, there's just a lot of unknowns. So they're kind of reaching out and saying, we just really don't know how, what is effective. So anything you want to add, Nancy?
Yeah, thanks for that opening, Nicole. I mean, I come to this work as a general education teacher and as a general education teacher educator. So I really defer to Nicole and Peter on the literature with autism, but I'll just say that, in my background as a general education teacher, I didn't learn a lot about how to best support learners with autism in the general education classroom. And so There were times now looking back, if I could, go back and right the wrongs of my past, things like fixated interests or joint attention were things that I may have considered as problematic behavior, in part because I didn't have that background or training. And so I think, as we'll talk about in just a little bit, there's a big need for this study, I think, especially as we start thinking about inclusion and these very well-intentioned efforts and laudable efforts to start moving students with autism into the general ed classroom.
Can we talk a little bit more about what the instructional practices are right now for children with autism? How individualized are they in terms of specifically math and literacy?
One of the things that we want to move forward on is to have more individualized instruction-based intervention for children with autism, which means we need to recognize that many children with autism, regardless of their verbal abilities in general ed or in special ed, have certain cognitive patterns that can get in the way of learning. And we need to understand those, and we need to allow teachers to know more about it. As Nancy said, things like there are attention problems, social cognitive problems, sensory problems, higher order language problems for some. All kids will have a different array of strengths and weaknesses, and we need to understand how to identify those and how to inform teachers in a way that helps them work more effectively with the kids.
Yeah, that makes sense. Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, so, a kind of pulling on this and then extending it a little farther. I also feel that really understanding the role of the environment. So as Peter had pointed out, we see these differences in individuals with autism when we look at emotion regulation and how they are taking up sensory information. And for years and years, folks have maybe misunderstood what those behaviors mean in a classroom environment. So specifically really thinking about, the role of the sensory environment and becoming kind of overwhelmed within that environment. Folks may misinterpret that as problematic behavior or misbehavior. So I think what we've been seeing is kind of a lot of kind of behavioral-based interventions kind of pushing in to classrooms, really focusing on how to get kids to comply and so forth. I like the question about how individualized do specifically math and reading interventions have to be for individuals with autism. And I think this really kind of varies across folks. So if you talk to different professionals, you're probably going to get different answers. But the one thing that my research is really looking into is just that question of how individualized does it have to be? Are there specific general education practices that will work nicely with individuals with autism if we just put in the right adaptations and modifications? And when we look at some folks in the autistic community that are now adults, kind of looking back at their elementary age specifically, we're targeting the elementary age, we're hearing that, that maybe there are some practices that do align. So I think that question of how individualized is really an unknown and an area to explore more.
Dr. Tseng, anything to add?
No, the only thing I'll add is that I think we're hoping to explore more, and I think we hope we'll have some of the answers in 4 years at the end of this, and even before, because it's a 4-year study, but we'll have some concrete recommendations and answers to that question.
Okay, great. You have all talked about general education versus special education. Could we talk maybe a little bit more specifically about what the different approaches are in each of these situations for students with autism? Maybe Dr. Sparapani?
Yeah, I can lead this one. There's an article that kind of sticks in my mind, and it was written in 2008, and I just can't get it out of my mind, but it talks about these kind of what's the word that I'm looking for? Like differences at the core of how educators are being taught in their programs. So differences in philosophies, that was the word I was looking for. So teaching practices and philosophies kind of are very different across special and general education teachers, again, from the time that they're in their programs and learning about how to interact and instruct individuals overall. One thing that my work has led into is differences in the language environment. So we see these, kind of vast differences in how much and what types of talk teachers are using with kids across classroom types. And that doesn't necessarily, it's not just related to cognitive differences or language differences. It really is just the kind of the environment. So we see more talk that is to get kids to comply or to follow directions, and more talk overall within special education environments. In general education environments, we see more open-ended talk, more kind of contextual talk. So really talking about what kids are experiencing, what's in front of them, and more academic based talk. And so what that potentially could mean is that we see these differences kind of across instruction and across languages in these different environments. And one environment might not, prepare the student if they're transitioning between environments. We just really have to kind of understand what that logistically could mean for students that may be going back and forth. And then also thinking about the opportunities that kids are getting across those two environments. Anything to add, Peter and Nancy?
The only thing I would add is some of the preliminary work and research that Nicole and I have been doing as we've been looking at teacher language. We've also noticed the importance of the nature of the task. And so the kind of task that students are engaging with really affords different kind of language opportunities that the teachers are using, which then also predicts student engagement and participation. And so that's something that, again, we're bringing to this new grant, is really bringing forward this idea of what's that relationship, both between teacher and student interactions, but also the content and the instructional opportunities that are presented in each of the contexts.
Then
I would just add that one of the big differences is training. And as Nancy said, for general ed teachers, we haven't done enough to really inform them about the neurodiversity and what that brings into the classroom, and how to feel confident in addressing the needs of all students. We do a lot in terms of discussions about cultural diversity, and we can simply mirror that and make a greater effort and allow for more time for general ed teachers to really understand the variety of kids they're seeing. And on the special ed side, we probably want to provide more understanding of instruction beyond the decades of the notion of very structured instruction for children with disabilities, and allow more modern instructional methods to interact with what we're teaching special ed students.
Do you have one more thing to add, Dr. Sparapani?
Yeah, and I think it was really well said. Peter just kind of wrapped up what I was going to, try to articulate. But I think that what this is also pointing out is this need to really understand that kind of every professional that is involved within a school setting has something unique to offer. So my background is in speech pathology, and if I were to teach a class, it would probably go south. It wouldn't be so well because I wasn't actually trained in how to deliver mathematics or literacy instruction. And I think that, when we look at general educators, they are trained in that area. When we look at special educators, they have a vast, area of knowledge that may or may not be in that area. So I think it really points to this need for educators to come together and really respect kind of the individual knowledge that they bring to the table, and have that interdisciplinary practice to really focus on how to best serve individuals with autism in classrooms.
Okay, great. I think we should catch people up here quickly. We've referenced this a few times, but I want to make sure people know what we're talking about, which is that all three of you are on a team recently awarded a $1.69 million grant from the National Center for Special Education Research, which is huge. And the goal of this 4-year collaborative study is to bridge autism research with general education, math, and literacy research, in particular, as you've mentioned, for students with autism in early elementary school. So can we talk a little bit more specifically about how this study will work? Maybe all of you?
Yeah, let's all speak at the same time. So this, I'm really excited about this. So I have to say that we tried for 3 years. And so to actually get this year is really, really exciting. I think that us as a team, again, in our backgrounds, we are modeling that idea of interdisciplinary practice, speech pathology, special education, psychology, autism specialist, general education, and Nancy is also a math educator. So I think we're kind of all coming at this with our own level of expertise. So what we are proposing is to really explore what is working in general education classrooms, specifically for kids with autism, but we also want to collect information on kids that don't have autism, because again, we want to see how individualized things actually have to be, what practices are working for all kids, what types of features are kids bringing into the classroom that maybe need different types of practices and so forth from teachers. So we are proposing a 4-year kind of exploratory, going in and observing how teachers are talking, what practices they're delivering in math and literacy instruction, how kids are engaging in those instructional opportunities, and then how that relates to learning outcomes. Did I miss anything, Nancy or Peter?
No, only that we're actively recruiting for this study. So this is our little plug too.
Dr. Mundy, anything else to add?
Well, the other thing I'd add is that this study, like many studies, provides a foundation for knowledge now and knowledge in the future. And the knowledge in the future part, we could talk about in many different ways, but this will feed forward to information about what do we do in the preschool period of time in terms of both teacher interaction and what things do we see that we really need to work on in terms of student school readiness. And conversely, following this up, things change in later elementary, middle, high school. This should inform more inquiry for those periods of time in school as well.
Yeah, it sounds like there could be some pretty significant implications in terms of classroom recommendations for the future. So we will definitely be checking in with you again on this. I just wanted to let everyone know that we are talking about the best instructional practices in math and literacy for students with autism with 3 experts in this area, Doctors Nicole Sparapani, Peter Mundy, and Nancy Tseng. If you have questions, please feel free to post them in the comments and we will answer them toward the end of the discussion. Looks like we have a couple of questions coming in, so we will be sure to get to those in just a few minutes. I wanted to ask a little bit more, given the goal of your research, about what is working well in today's classrooms, both in terms of math and literacy, and what isn't. And if you could give any sort of specific examples, that would be really helpful. Maybe start with you, Dr. Mundy.
I can probably talk would be most informed about literacy. We've done a sequence of studies on reading and math, but mostly on reading. And I think teachers are making every effort to respond appropriately to the needs of children in terms of literacy. And literacy and reading, at first you're trying to develop basic reading skills, which then allow you to move into literacy. And yet there isn't a lot of awareness that the basic nature of autism is to affect social communication and social communication development. And reading is a cultural next step in social communication development that you only arrive at through instruction. And so, there's these children with autism, regardless of, what kind of classroom placement, there's a large group that are at risk for having problems with developing reading. And they may not look like other children who have dyslexia, which is the more typical reading problem, which really involves the ability to parse sounds and identify words. Rather, it seems like for the preponderance of children with autism who struggle with reading, it's reading comprehension. And we have pretty good early curriculums for phonological processing and getting at that aspect of reading. But instructional methods for reading comprehension probably need to be better articulated, better developed for the needs of some children with autism and other children with ADHD. So a lot is being done that's good, I think, in the first 3 years. And then we really have to figure out which kids aren't going to move on and have really well-developed reading comprehension. And it may be related to oral language comprehension. And we'll find out more about that in the study.
Great. Dr. Tseng or Sparapani?
Sure, I'll talk a little bit about math instruction. I think with math, there tends to be this pervasive belief, I think throughout society too, that people are either math people or not. And so I think that's something that just by and large isn't working very well. I think kind of boxing kids into categories. I also think that there tends to be this belief sometimes that students have to master very kind of basic math facts before they can move on to more cognitively demanding tasks. And so, a couple of things that we know works well in math instruction come from the framework that actually we're going to be using in this study. Comes from Alan Schoenfeld's work at UC Berkeley, the TRUE framework, so teaching for a robust understanding. So a couple of the different dimensions that he talks about is really the importance of making sure that all students are really engaging with high quality and substantive math content. And making sure that they have opportunities to do sense making, right? Not just rote practice, not just recall, but really grappling with important disciplinary ideas. Related to that, access to content, right? Creating different participatory structures that allow all learners to be both meaningfully involved in the lesson, but also communicate their ideas in ways that make sense to them. And that might be verbally or non-verbally. And that, as again, Nicole and I have been doing some research, observing some math lessons, we've seen that when students have an opportunity to have manipulatives and demonstrate their understanding, and that is very engaging for students as well, and also gives teachers an idea of how students are making sense of the math too. And then we also know that we want all students to develop positive math identities and recognize that everyone can be, a math thinker and doer.
Yeah, I really like that. So I've learned a lot about, math instruction. And as Nancy was just saying, we have this paper that's currently under review where we studied or examined I think it was 136 instructional lessons. And I think what's really promising is what the general education literature is suggesting about mathematics practices. We saw that align really nicely with our data. So, when kids, as Nancy had just said, were given opportunities to have materials, that was a really big one. So we saw often that they didn't have, it was like 60% of the time, there was a lot of talk happening without materials. But as soon as we saw kids having materials in front of them where they could take up or express their understanding of concepts, whether it was just something that was more simple, like show me what 5 is, versus something that was much more complex. With the use of materials, we really saw that engagement. And again, we're theoretically thinking that that's going to link to their mathematics learning. The one thing that I can kind of speak kind of across literacy and math instruction for learners with autism and also learners just in general education classrooms that don't have autism is the use of teacher's language. And so we're seeing that there are these features that are linked to learning in the general education literature, specifically thinking about teachers' use of responsiveness, how they're taking up students' ideas, and their communication overall, and the feedback that they're giving them, the opportunities and the questions and the comments that they're making, again, specifically around the materials. We're seeing those things are linked to learning in general education classrooms. And we're seeing that same thing in math and literacy lessons for kids with autism. So when teachers are providing these opportunities where they are, again, talking about the material, giving kids an opportunity to kind of answer in whatever way they can, to a comment or an open-ended question is related to their participation. So I think that's really promising. But the second half of your question is what's not going well. And I think that what's not going well is that we're not seeing that as frequently as maybe we should be. So if, these, and this is what I think our project will highlight in the end, what types of features and tasks are best for different types of, different kids with different learning profiles. But we're seeing currently a lot of, kind of directives, just, directing kids' attention, directing kids' behavior, and that stuff is taking away from the learning opportunity. The other thing I just want to point out quickly without hogging the stage here is, one thing I think that is interesting to explore a little farther is that within academic contexts or lessons, we're seeing kind of more focus on specific goals like social skills, communication goals, behavior-based goals. I think, again, with all good intention that, there is this kind of trying to weave in IEP goals to academic lessons. But what we're seeing is that that's stripping away from the academic learning. So we may see that, there's more compliance, even more communication, but, the literature and our data is pointing to potentially that's taking away from that academic learning. So we have to kind of find a way to really kind of create these opportunities for kids that are engaging and that are also supporting the academic learning.
Dr. Sparapani, I'm going to have to ask you to hog it a little bit longer. Sorry. No, I just wanted to talk. You've mentioned it a couple of times. I want to dig a little bit deeper. You recently published a paper evaluating teacher language in general and special education classrooms. And I just wondered if you could talk about just why the language matters so much and what the impact is on educational outcomes for the students.
I think this is a really kind of promising area for, for future research and just specifically looking at an intervention target, kind of across context. So when we look at the interactions between teachers and students, we are seeing that, what and how the teacher kind of delivers information and the features of talk that they're using is related to how engaged students are. And so when we look at the interaction between the two, if the teacher were to change, then we're seeing that potentially could change how the student engages. And then again, that is then linked to learning. So again, I think that by focusing on teacher-student interactions, we really have kind of an intervention target that we can use across interventions, across contexts, and across classrooms. And then again, what we're seeing in my work, in the work that Nancy and I have been doing is that, again, often teachers are, and I've kind of said this, but often teachers are kind of, presenting more talk to direct and redirect behavior. So again, I think if we just think about that in itself, we could use that as a jump off point to saying like, how can we change that then may change students' responses to that. And then last, in that recent paper that you just referred to, what we saw is that teachers are often using, more directive talk with students that have either more autism specific symptoms, like less joint attention or thinking about their social communication. So, there are these specific features that or characteristics that kids are presenting with that are then influencing the talk that teachers use. So I think it's a nice area to, again, to kind of dive into, because I think we can, really think about how we can impact learning just by looking at this reciprocity between teachers and students.
Yeah, lots of great issues to discuss. I'm going to ask one more from me, and then we have several from viewers that we'll get to. The last question I'd love you all to weigh in on is, what are the biggest challenges to instituting best practices in the classroom? Can we start with you, Dr. Tseng?
Sure. I mean, I think one that both Nicole and Peter have touched on a little bit is, I think one of the challenges is trying to create spaces for more interdisciplinary collaboration. I think our study is indicative of that we need to, we don't know enough, and that it's going to take people from different disciplines working together. And I think that can definitely be a challenge. Again, I'll kind of harken back to my experiences as a general ed classroom teacher. We didn't have enough time and space or resources to do that. And so I think that is one of the central challenges that is kind of fundamental to this work that I think we'll need to continue to think about.
Dr. Mundy?
Well, it's a very difficult thing. And I think Nancy just touched on it. Time. Teachers work very, very hard, and they're being asked increasingly to meet more and more mandates. And so, I think the biggest challenge is how to get this, develop the knowledge, then get it into training programs, but then also probably have additional expertise in schools to sort of coach teachers in a more extended fashion. And so that's way down the road, but on a nationwide basis, at least something like that will probably be necessary to fully implement what will probably come out of this research.
Great. Dr. Sparapani, anything to add?
Yeah, I think, the first thing that popped into my head around this question is just this shift. I think that as educational environments, as we know them, really have to shift. I think that the classroom has to become this more dynamic environment where, we see this kind of variability in learners, kind of across learners, and that's accepted. So the framework that comes to mind is universal design for learning. Across California, this is something that our teacher educators are currently learning, and our teachers in classrooms are receiving lots of professional development on how to kind of transform the classroom environment to be this dynamic space. Again, in theory, this sounds really great because, you're creating these learning environments where we're supposed to be targeting, all students. And so, if you offer, these different types of activities, different seating arrangements, ways for kids to demonstrate their understanding to all kids, you don't just have a few kids falling out. I think there's a lot of promise in that, but I think that one of the biggest challenges is really implementing that, at a large scale, really seeing this across, classrooms and districts across the nation. So I think that, again, that need for change, and then really thinking about that interdisciplinary practice, I think is just absolutely critical to be able to support kids well. It's just too much information for one discipline to take on.
That certainly makes sense. Okay, I want to pivot to a couple of questions that we've received from viewers. The first one is there data on whether there are a greater proportion of children with autism who have reading problems or a greater proportion of children with autism who have math problems? So they're wondering if you can say statistically a child with autism is more likely to have one or the other. Is that something we can answer?
We don't have enough data. There's probably only about 10 studies that really look at math and reading together. They look at them at different ages, and they use lots of different measures. So it's been very, very hard to compare. So I would say, there is no clear answer to that at this point in time. What we do know, though, is that these are relatively common problems and sometimes co-occur in children. So it's common enough that we want to really make a great effort to alert schools that this is something that needs to be considered in addition to the classic behavior patterns of children with autism. And Nicole was referring to that. We do a lot of social skills work and things of that nature, and those get built into the IEP. We now need to also understand that academic goals are really, really important to many of these kids.
Can I just add on to that? And that, again, I think that, Peter, that was very well articulated. The one thing that I would just add on to is that when we think about academic skills, they're not innate. So when we think about language, individuals develop language, but when we think about math and literacy skills, individuals need to be taught. And so I think, again, our role with looking at the opportunities, the math learning opportunities and the literacy learning opportunities, and how much kids are actually in rich learning opportunities to learn, I think is going to be something that can influence how well they learn it.
Okay, let's move on to the next one, which is, are there any in-home programs for speech therapy? Anybody able to answer that one?
In-home programs for speech therapy, specifically around math and literacy?
It doesn't specify, I'm sorry, but if that's the best answer, I think we can certainly approach it in that way, since that's what we're talking about.
I think, and Peter, this might be something that you can chime into as well. I think that there are some interventions specifically in literacy that are being evaluated for learners with autism. I think, again, what we are proposing are there are specific features, again, as I mentioned, using responsive language and some of the features of talk that are linked to learning. We're seeing there are parallels there too for kids with autism, but evidence-based practices that have been tested, we're not there yet in terms of individuals with autism. Anything to add on that, Peter?
Well, I think that's the issue. I mean, there's a great variety of different targets for speech and communication therapy with autism. There can be dysarthria up through, higher level language skills. And so, we have some idea of what are considered to be evidence-based interventions. But it's rare that, since we don't have too many of those, it's rare that we have evidence for in-home practices yet. And so the likelihood is that there aren't a lot that are evidence-based. There might be some that are very effective in-home methods, but it's hard to recommend any because there's a lack of evidence for most of those at this time.
Okay, we have another question here about how to help with attention span. This person has a 6-year-old son who has a lot of trouble sitting still for more than a few seconds. Says it's affecting him in school and speech therapy and other places. Any tips on attention span help?
Well, with any child, regardless of whether they're a child with autism or not, whenever you see a symptom presentation that's disrupting their lives and decreasing the quality of their lives, you want to take that seriously. And so you probably want to have that evaluated. A child with autism can be very attentive or very inattentive, but a child with autism might be so inattentive that they actually are comorbid or perhaps comorbid for ADHD. And so, at 6 years, that's about the time when you might begin to see enough behavior to suspect that. And certainly if it continues to 7 through 8, you'd want to have it evaluated by a clinician. And then on the basis of what the clinician's evaluation is, you follow recommendations for treatment.
And then, again, the role of the environment, I think, plays a big, part of this as well. So I think about, again, we do a lot with video observations and watching kids in classrooms, and often they're expected to sit, but they don't really have a clear role of what to do. So if something that's more simple and straightforward would be, making sure that that individual has a clear role and that has, actual tangible things in his or her hands to be able to manipulate. And then again, what we're seeing in our research is, rather than constantly kind of direct behavior or direct attention to come back to that chair, really thinking about following that kid's lead and being responsive to what is, that the individual is communicating. And so kind of those are just, quick little things to kind of think about is how much language is being used, opportunities to have access to materials, and then really thinking about setting up activities that are motivating, that align with the individual's interests.
Okay, great advice. Thank you both. We have a couple of questions about the study. First one is, who would people contact if they're interested in the study, and what ages?
Yay, thank you. Thank you for the Nancy. So you can contact any of us. I believe that our email addresses and such are going to be available after this.
We can post it in the comments. Yep.
Perfect. So we are looking for general education teachers who have a child with autism in their classroom. We're also looking for general education teachers who do not have a child with autism in their classrooms. We want to have both a sample of kiddos with autism and also a sample without. Kindergarten through third grade is the age that we're targeting right now. So yes, please come forward. And this is a little bit different of a study because it is more exploratory. So we want to learn from general education teachers. So the goal is for us to observe their literacy and math lessons as they plan and to really learn about the components that are working for different individuals on the autism spectrum and those that do not have autism.
Okay, and one more question about the study, a good one. Will the study involve public school settings and or non-public school settings?
So we're currently looking at public school settings for individuals with autism. Peter, is there any, do you know if we could include non-public?
We could include non-public as long as, but in order to do that, we would probably have to have a sizable number because the non-public student-child ratios may be different and things like that. And so you know, the PI, who is Nicole, would and all of us would have to consider whether or not that's an advantage or a disadvantage. So right now the plan is public school, but certainly if non-public school teachers are interested, we want to hear from them, because if enough are interested, then that could really help the study and add a new component to it.
Okay, great. That is it for our viewer questions. Got a lot of great questions. Thank you so much for contributing them. Thank you everyone for watching. And thank you, Dr. Mundy, Dr. Tseng, Dr. Sparapani, so much for being with us today and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us for this UC Davis Mind Institute Facebook Live. If you do have any other questions, you can still post them in the comments. We can try to answer them after, and we will post the information about the study for people to contact. And we encourage you to please share this post if you think you have family or friends who might be interested in learning from it. Thank you for joining us.